Marcus, let's get him on the stretcher. On three.
I said step away!
Take your hand off me. Officer.
The Orlando sun was already a heavy, wet blanket at 7:03 a.m., promising a Sunday that would be as suffocating as it was serene. Inside Station 9, the air conditioning hummed a steady, cool counterpoint to the rising heat outside. Imani Williams, 42 years old and a 17-year veteran of the Orange County Fire Rescue, took a slow sip of her coffee. It was her one ritual, a single cup, black and strong, before the chaos began. The quiet moments were rare, and she cherished them. They were the brief pauses in a life defined by sirens, a life measured in the frantic space between a 911 call and the hospital doors. She was a mother of two, a woman who had braided her daughter's hair that morning and reminded her son about his history paper, all before donning a uniform that carried the faint, indelible scent of antiseptic and stranger's fear. Her partner, Marcus Rivas, a solid, dependable man whose calm demeanor was the perfect anchor to her focused intensity, was meticulously checking the supply levels in their ambulance, a rolling emergency room they called home for 12 hours at a time. "Mornin', Monty," he'd said when she arrived, the greeting as familiar and comfortable as the worn driver's seat of the rig. "Sleep well?" She hadn't, not really. Her daughter had a slight fever, and a mother's sleep is always light, one ear tuned to the sounds of the house. But she just smiled. "Like a rock. You?" It was their code, their way of leaving the world behind when they clocked in. Out here, they were a unit. They had to be. Imani ran a hand over the smooth, cool metal of the countertop. She'd seen it all in her 17 years. The brutal, mangled wreckage of multi-car pileups on I-4. The quiet, tragic stillness of a crib death. The astonishing resilience of a construction worker who had fallen 3 stories and lived to complain about the hospital food. She had delivered babies in the back of the ambulance and held the hands of the dying as they took their last, shuddering breath. The job had carved lines of concentration around her eyes and given her a deep, almost unnerving calm in the face of pandemonium. She understood that panic was a luxury she could not afford. Her steady hands and clear mind were often the only things standing between a person's life and their grave. She was good at her job, not just proficient, but truly gifted. She could read the subtle, unspoken language of a patient's body, the slight cyanosis around the lips, the barely perceptible tremor in their hands, the smell of acetone on their breath. It was an instinct honed by thousands of calls, a sixth sense that went beyond the textbooks and protocols. It was this instinct that made her the person you prayed would answer your call on the worst day of your life. It was a heavy responsibility, but one she carried with a quiet grace. The first few hours of the shift passed in a gentle rhythm. A minor fender bender with no injuries, a false alarm from a faulty smoke detector at a nursing home, a lift assist for an elderly man who had slipped in his bathroom. It was the typical Sunday morning fare, a slow build before the inevitable emergencies that came with the afternoon heat and weekend activities. Marcus was telling her about his son's latest baseball game, his voice a low rumble in the cab as they drove back from the lift assist, when the radio crackled, shattering the calm. The voice of the dispatcher was a familiar professional monotone, yet it carried an unmistakable urgency that made Imani's spine straighten instantly. "Unit 9, respond to a medical emergency, 1412 Whisper Creek Lane. Adult male, approximately 20 years old, experiencing seizures. Caller is the mother, states he is unresponsive and convulsing." Imani was already reaching for the console microphone before the dispatcher finished. "Unit 9 responding," she said, her voice betraying none of the adrenaline that was beginning to course through her veins. She glanced at the GPS on the dash. Whisper Creek Lane, one of the newer, wealthier subdivisions on the edge of her district. Manicured lawns, oversized houses, and a false sense of security. Trouble didn't care about property values. Marcus didn't need to be told. He hit the siren and the lights in one smooth motion, the familiar whoop-whoop cutting through the quiet suburban morning. The force of the acceleration pressed Imani back into her seat as he expertly navigated the residential streets. Her mind was already a blur of activity, a high-speed library of protocols and procedures. Seizures in a young adult. Could be anything. Epilepsy, a recent head trauma, a drug overdose, meningitis. The possibilities were a checklist she ran through, preparing for each one. She began pulling on a pair of nitrile gloves, the snap against her wrists a small, focusing sound in the wailing cocoon of the ambulance. This was it. The quiet part of the day was over. The clock was ticking again, its seconds measured in the violent, uncontrolled spasms of a young man's body. The race was on. The house on Whisper Creek Lane was a large, two-story beige stucco home that looked like every other house in the subdivision, distinguished only by the raw panic radiating from its open front door. A woman in her late 40s, dressed in yoga pants and a tank top, was on the porch, her face a mask of terror, her hand pressed to her mouth as she waved them down. This was Sarah Collins, a mother watching her child slip away. "He's in the living room! Please, hurry!" she cried, her voice cracking. Imani was out of the ambulance before Marcus had fully killed the engine, grabbing the jump bag, a 40-pound kit containing everything she needed for the first critical minutes of advanced life support. "Marcus, grab the stretcher and the airway bag," she called over her shoulder, her eyes already scanning, assessing, taking in the scene with a professional's rapid-fire comprehension. She followed the mother into a pristine, sunlit living room, polished hardwood floors, tasteful modern furniture, a large flat-screen TV on the wall, an oasis of domestic calm violently disrupted by the scene on the floor. A young man, his body rigid and drenched in sweat, was convulsing on a plush area rug. His back was arched, his jaw was clenched, and a thin line of foamy saliva flecked his lips. His eyes, wide and unseeing, were rolled back in his head. This was Ethan Collins, 20 years old, and he was in the grip of a grand mal seizure. "Okay, ma'am, I'm Imani. I'm a paramedic. What's his name?" Imani asked, her voice a calm, commanding presence in the chaos as she dropped to her knees beside him. She didn't touch him yet, not during the active tonic-clonic phase. Her first priority was to protect him from injury. "Ethan," the mother sobbed. "He's never had one before. He was just watching TV and he just fell over and started shaking." "Does he have any medical history? Any recent falls or head injuries? Is he on any medication?" Imani's questions were quick, precise. She was building a diagnostic picture in her head. "No, nothing. He's perfectly healthy. He plays soccer at the university." Imani's gaze swept the room. She noticed a half-full water bottle on the coffee table, a video game controller, nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of drug paraphernalia, no obvious clues. She glanced at Ethan. The violent convulsions were beginning to subside, the thrashing of his limbs slowing. This was her window. As the rigid tonic phase gave way to the flaccid post-ictal state, she moved in. Her fingers went immediately to his carotid artery, feeling for a pulse. It was there, rapid and thready, but strong. His breathing was shallow and ragged, a strained, snoring sound that told her his airway was partially obstructed. "He's post-ictal," she announced to Marcus, who had just entered with the stretcher. "Let's get him on his side, recovery position." Together, they gently rolled Ethan onto his left side, a simple maneuver that allowed the saliva to drain from his mouth and his tongue to fall forward, clearing his airway. The snoring sound immediately lessened. Imani used a small flashlight to check his pupils. They were sluggish but reactive. She attached a pulse oximeter to his finger. The small screen glowed to life. 88%. Too low. His brain wasn't getting enough oxygen. "Let's get him on high-flow O2, non-rebreather mask," she instructed. Marcus, anticipating the command, already had the oxygen tank ready. As he fitted the mask over Ethan's face, Imani worked with practiced efficiency, cutting away the sleeve of his t-shirt with a pair of trauma shears to get access for an IV line. His skin was clammy, his muscles limp after the violent exertion. He was still unconscious, lost in the neurological storm that had just ravaged his brain. She found a good vein in his forearm, expertly sliding in an 18-gauge catheter on the first try. "Got a line," she said, securing it with tape and connecting a bag of saline, letting it run wide open to help stabilize his blood pressure. Every action was deliberate, economical, honed by years of practice. There was no wasted movement, no hesitation. This was her element, a symphony of controlled urgency where she was the conductor. The pulse oximeter began to creep up. 92%, 94%, 96%. Good. The oxygen was working. Ethan let out a low groan, a sign he was slowly starting to emerge from the depths of unconsciousness. "You're doing great, Ethan," Imani said, her voice soft but firm, even though she knew he couldn't understand her. It was as much for his mother as it was for him. "We're taking good care of you." She looked up at Sarah Collins, who was watching with wide, terrified eyes. "We've stabilized him for now, but he needs to go to the hospital right away to find out what caused this. We're going to get him onto our stretcher now." She and Marcus positioned themselves on either side of Ethan, ready to perform a coordinated lift. It was in that exact moment, as they prepared to move their patient, that a new sound cut through the tense quiet of the room. The sharp, authoritative rap of knuckles on the open front door, followed by a voice that dripped with suspicion. "Orlando Police Department, what's going on in here?" The man who stepped through the doorway was young, probably in his late 20s, with a military-style buzz cut and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. His uniform was crisp, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He wore a pair of reflective sunglasses that hid his eyes, creating an impassive, intimidating mask. His hand was resting on his holstered firearm, not in a threatening way, but in a posture of casual, ingrained readiness that spoke volumes. The nameplate on his uniform read, Kincaid. Officer Kincaid's entire demeanor radiated an aggressive, coiled energy that felt jarringly out of place in the sunlit, panic-filled living room. He wasn't assessing the scene for a medical emergency, he was scanning it for threats. His eyes darted from the distraught mother to Marcus, then settled on Imani, who was kneeling over the prone, unconscious body of Ethan. A black woman, a white mother in hysterics, a young white man on the floor. In Kincaid's mind, a switch flipped. A narrative born of prejudice and poor training began to write itself. "Officer, thank God you're here," Sarah Collins said, taking a step toward him. "It's my son, he had a seizure." Kincaid held up a hand, silencing her without even looking at her. His full attention was locked on Imani. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from him and show me your hands," he said. The voice was flat, devoid of any inflection, a voice that expected instant, unquestioning compliance. Imani, who was in the middle of checking the IV line, paused. She looked up, her mind momentarily struggling to process the command. For a split second, she thought he must be talking to the mother. Then she realized his gaze, hidden behind those reflective lenses, was fixed squarely on her. "Officer, I'm a paramedic with Orange County Fire Rescue," she said, her tone deliberately even and professional. She had dealt with hundreds of police officers over the years. Coordination was key. "We're treating a patient who just experienced a grand mal seizure. We're preparing to transport him to the hospital." Kincaid took another step into the room, planting his feet in a wide, territorial stance. He didn't acknowledge her explanation. He didn't look at Marcus, who stood by the stretcher in his identical uniform. He didn't look at the medical bags, the oxygen tank, or any of the other obvious signs of a medical emergency. He only saw what his bias allowed him to see. "I didn't ask who you were," he snapped, his voice getting sharper. "I gave you an order. Step away from the individual on the floor, now." A cold knot of disbelief and anger began to form in Imani's stomach. This wasn't standard procedure. This wasn't an officer trying to help. This was an officer trying to take control of a situation he clearly did not understand. Her patient was vulnerable. Ethan was just starting to stir, his groans becoming more frequent. The post-ictal phase was a delicate time. Patients could be confused, combative, or even suffer another seizure. The last thing he needed was a shouting cop escalating the tension in the room. "Sir, with all due respect, this is a critical medical scene," Imani said. keeping her voice as calm as she could muster. She would not be intimidated. She would not be distracted. Her patient came first. My priority right now is him. She gestured with her head toward Ethan. I cannot leave him. Marcus stepped forward, his hands held up in a placating gesture. Officer, my name is Marcus Rivas. This is my partner, Imani Williams. We're Unit 9. The scene is secure. There's no threat here. We just need to get our patient to the hospital. Kincaid finally shifted his gaze to Marcus, then back to Imani. His lip curled into a slight sneer. I'll determine if the scene is secure, not you. For the last time, lady, get off of him and back away. The word lady was laced with a dismissive contempt that made Imani's blood run cold. This was going wrong, fast. She had seen this type of officer before, young, insecure, and desperate to assert an authority they hadn't yet earned. They were dangerous. They saw challenges where there were none and created conflict out of thin air. Her mind raced. She had to de-escalate this, not for her own sake, but for Ethan's. Every second they wasted arguing was a second stolen from his care. Officer, she began, starting to rise to her feet slowly to show she wasn't a threat. I understand you have a job to do, but so do I. My patient is my only concern. But Kincaid wasn't listening. He saw her movement not as an attempt to comply, but as defiance. His hand dropped from his weapon and he began to unsnap the keeper on his holster. The small click was a deafening sound in the tense room. Don't make me repeat myself again, he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. The narrative in his head was now complete. He wasn't at a medical emergency, he was at an assault in progress, and he was the hero who had arrived just in time to stop it. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, charged with a terrifying potential energy. Sarah Collins, who had been watching the exchange with a growing sense of bewildered horror, finally found her voice. Officer, what are you doing? She's helping him. She's a paramedic. Can't you see her uniform? Kincaid shot a venomous glare in her direction. Ma'am, you need to stay out of this. You don't know what's happening here. I know exactly what's happening, she shrieked, her panic turning to outrage. My son collapsed. I called 911, and she is the one who came to save him. You are the one who is making things worse. Her words, meant to clarify, only served to cement Kincaid's flawed reality. To him, the mother was clearly hysterical, perhaps even a victim herself, coerced into protecting her attacker. It was a twisted, incomprehensible logic, but in his mind it was the only thing that made sense. He saw Imani, a black woman, and his brain, poisoned by a lifetime of societal stereotypes and insufficient training, filled in the rest of the story with dark, imagined details. Imani knew she was out of time. The argument was fruitless. Kincaid was operating in a different universe, one governed by his own paranoia. Her only priority was Ethan. The young man on the floor groaned again, louder this time, and tried to shift his body. He was entering the confused, disoriented stage of waking up. He needed to be transported now, before he became agitated and pulled out his own IV line. She made a decision. She would not engage with the officer anymore. She would do her job. She turned her back on Kincaid, a deliberate and complete dismissal, and focused her full attention on her patient. Marcus, she said, her voice a sharp, clear command that cut through the tension. Let's get him on the stretcher, on 3. It was a calculated risk. She was betting that by ignoring him and focusing on the obvious medical task at hand, he might be forced to see the reality of the situation. It was a bet she would lose spectacularly. Her dismissal was the final insult to Kincaid's fragile authority. It was a direct challenge he could not tolerate. He saw her turning her back not as a paramedic tending to a patient, but as a suspect refusing a lawful order. I said, step away, he roared. As Imani and Marcus bent down, positioning their hands to lift Ethan, Kincaid moved. He crossed the room in 2 quick strides, and his hand clamped down on Imani's upper arm. His grip was like iron, a sudden, shocking violation that sent a jolt through her body. You don't get to ignore me, he growled, his face inches from hers. The sterile mask of his sunglasses reflected a distorted image of her own stunned expression. The world seemed to slow down. The feel of his fingers digging into her bicep, the sight of Ethan's pale, slack-jawed face just below her, the sound of Marcus's sharp intake of breath. The line had been crossed. This was no longer a disagreement over jurisdiction. This was a physical assault. "Take your hand off me, officer," Imani said, her voice dangerously quiet, all the professional calm stripped away to reveal a core of cold, hard fury. "You are interfering with emergency medical personnel. You are obstructing the treatment of my patient." "You're under arrest," Kincaid declared, the words booming with a sense of triumphant finality. He seemed to relish the statement, the ultimate expression of his power. The declaration was so absurd, so completely divorced from the reality of the situation, that for a moment Imani could only stare at him. Arrested? Arrested for what? For refusing to abandon a sick man? "Arrested for what?" Marcus demanded, stepping between them, trying to shield his partner. "Are you insane? We're doing our jobs!" Kincaid shoved Marcus back, a powerful, aggressive movement that sent him stumbling. "She's under arrest for obstruction and assault on a police officer," he yelled, inventing a crime on the spot. "Assault?" Imani cried, her voice raw with disbelief. "I haven't even touched you!" But Kincaid was beyond reason. He had committed to this path, and now he would see it through, no matter how destructive. He spun her around with surprising force, wrenching her arms behind her back with a painful torque. The cold, unforgiving steel of handcuffs closed around her wrists. The sharp click, 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 as the ratchet tightened, was the loudest sound Imani had ever heard. It was the sound of finality, the sound of utter insanity. It was the sound of a world turned upside down, where a paramedic trying to save a life was treated like a violent criminal. The bite of the metal into her skin was a sharp, grounding pain in the midst of the surreal chaos. She wasn't just being detained, she was being broken. "My patient!" The cry was torn from Imani's throat, her professional composure finally shattering under the weight of the nightmare. It was a raw, desperate plea. As Kincaid roughly pulled her to her feet, she twisted her head, her eyes locking on the vulnerable figure of Ethan still lying on the floor. "Marcus, don't stop! You have to get him to the hospital! You have to go!" Marcus, snapped out of his shocked paralysis by her voice, immediately scrambled back to Ethan's side. His hands, though shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and righteous rage, moved with purpose, checking the man's vitals, adjusting the oxygen mask. He was alone now, one paramedic forced to do the work of two, his partner being dragged away in handcuffs. The scene erupted. Sarah Collins let out a piercing scream, a sound of pure maternal anguish and disbelief. "What are you doing to her? Leave her alone! My son needs her!" She lunged toward Kincaid, but he just shoved her away with his free hand, sending her stumbling back against the sofa. "Get back or you'll be in cuffs too," he snarled. Imani felt a surge of white-hot fury. He had assaulted her, arrested her, and now he was threatening the frantic mother of the patient she was trying to save. This wasn't law enforcement, this was tyranny. "You have no idea what you've just done," she said, her voice trembling with a tightly controlled rage as Kincaid began marching her toward the front door. "That man could die. His life is on you now." "You should have followed my orders," Kincaid grunted, his grip tightening on her arm. "This is on you." He forced her out of the house and into the blinding morning sun. The idyllic suburban street, with its manicured lawns and cheerful flower beds, seemed like a bizarre backdrop for the horror that was unfolding. Neighbors were starting to peek out of their windows, drawn by the shouting and the wail of the ambulance siren, which Marcus had left running. They were met with the incomprehensible sight of a paramedic in uniform being forcibly frog-marched to a police car. As he shoved her toward his patrol car, Imani's eyes remained locked on the house. She saw Marcus on his radio, his mouth moving frantically, likely calling for a supervisor, for another unit, for anyone who could fix this disaster. Every second that ticked by while she was being treated like a criminal was a second Ethan's chances of a full recovery diminished. A seizure itself isn't always life-threatening, but the complications, the lack of oxygen to the brain, the potential for aspiration, the underlying cause, were a ticking clock. Kincaid hadn't just delayed her, he had ripped the heart out of the emergency response. The door of the patrol car was opened. The heat from the black upholstery washed over her in a suffocating wave. Kincaid pushed her unceremoniously into the back seat. There was no attempt to be gentle, no regard for her dignity. He slammed the door shut with a deafening thud, sealing her in a plastic and metal cage. Through the reinforced glass and the metal grate, she watched the scene play out like a silent, horrifying movie. She saw Sarah Collins run back into the house, likely to be with her son. She saw Marcus, a lone first responder, working desperately over Ethan, a hero abandoned on his own island of chaos. The red and white lights of the ambulance flashed rhythmically, painting the serene street in strokes of urgent color, a stark contrast to the ugliness of the moment. She was a paramedic, cuffed in the back of a police car, watching the aftermath of the emergency she was supposed to be commanding. The person who had put her there was the one who was supposed to be her partner in these life-or-death situations. He hadn't just arrested her. He had betrayed the most fundamental duty of any public servant. He had chosen to harm rather than to help. In that moment, sitting in the suffocating heat of the car, the vinyl seat sticking to her uniform, a cold, clear resolution formed in the pit of her stomach. This would not stand. Officer Kincaid thought he had won. He thought he had asserted his dominance, put a defiant woman in her place. What he had actually done was ignite a firestorm. He had just made the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of his career, and she would spend every last ounce of her strength making sure he and the department that empowered him would be held accountable for it. The battle for Ethan's life may have been lost in that living room, but her war for justice had just begun. The back of the patrol car was an oven. The air was thick and still, trapping the smell of stale coffee and the chemical scent of the plastic partition. The handcuffs, cinched tight behind her back, dug into her wrists with every slight movement, a constant, painful reminder of her powerlessness. Through the metal grate, she watched Officer Kincaid. He stood beside his driver's side door, his back to her, speaking calmly into the radio microphone clipped to his shoulder. He was crafting his narrative, sanitizing the violent, irrational series of events into a tidy, justifiable report. He was turning her life-saving actions into a story of obstruction, her professional urgency into a tale of non-compliance. He was building his fortress of lies. Imani pressed her face against the hot window, her gaze fixed on the house she'd been torn from. A new sound pierced the air. Another siren, growing steadily louder. A second ambulance. Marcus's call for backup had been answered. Relief warred with a fresh wave of anger in her chest. Help was coming, but it was help that should never have been needed. The response was no longer a seamless chain of care. It was a broken, desperate scramble. An eternity later, probably less than 5 minutes in reality, the second ambulance screamed to a stop behind hers. 2 new paramedics, a man and a woman Imani knew vaguely from another station, jumped out and rushed toward the house, carrying their own equipment. Imani watched as Marcus met them at the door, a frantic, hurried exchange of information passing between them. She saw Marcus gesture wildly, pointing from the house to the patrol car where she was imprisoned. The female paramedic's head whipped around, her eyes widening in disbelief and professional outrage as she saw Imani's face pressed against the glass. The look was a mirror of what Imani felt. One of us is in handcuffs while a patient is coding. It was a violation of a sacred trust, a betrayal of their shared mission. The new crew, along with Marcus, finally emerged from the house, moving with the controlled haste of a team in crisis. They were wheeling Ethan on the stretcher. His body was limp, his face partially covered by an oxygen mask. But even from a distance, Imani could see the terrifyingly vacant look of someone whose brain had been starved of oxygen for too long. Was he breathing on his own? Was he stable? The not knowing was a physical torment. As they loaded him into the back of their ambulance, Marcus jogged over to the patrol car. He couldn't open the door, but he leaned close to the window, his face pale and streaked with sweat and fury. "They're taking him to Orlando Regional," he said, his voice strained. "He had another seizure right after Kincaid took you. A big one. We had to bag him for a minute. His oxygen levels dropped into the 70s. The words hit Imani like a physical blow. He had another seizure. His oxygen had plummeted. The catastrophic event she had been working to prevent had happened, precipitated by the chaos Kincaid had introduced. The delay, the stress, the absence of a second trained paramedic, it had all compounded into a worst-case scenario. This wasn't a theoretical risk anymore. It was measured in the death of brain cells, in the potential destruction of a young man's future. "Marcus, you need to call the battalion chief now," Imani instructed, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. She was compartmentalizing, shifting from paramedic to incident commander of her own disaster. "You need to document everything. The time Kincaid arrived, the time he first interfered, the time of my arrest. Every single second. Write it down." "Already did," Marcus said, his jaw tight. "He's on his way to the station. The whole world is about to come down on this guy's head." The other ambulance pulled away, its lights flashing, its siren a mournful cry that cut a path through the quiet neighborhood. Imani watched it go until it was just a speck in the distance, carrying away the patient she had been forced to abandon. A profound sense of failure washed over her, a feeling so alien and nauseating she felt like she might be sick. She knew logically that the failure was not her own, but in her heart, every paramedic carries the weight of their patient's outcome. She had been responsible for Ethan Collins, and she had been stopped from fulfilling that responsibility. Officer Kincaid finally finished his radio call and climbed into the driver's seat. He adjusted his rearview mirror, and for a brief moment, his eyes met hers in the reflection. There was no remorse in his gaze, no uncertainty, only a cold, self-satisfied hardness. He had enforced his will, and in his world, that was the only thing that mattered. He started the engine and pulled away from the scene without a word, leaving Marcus standing alone on the curb beside their empty ambulance. The silence in the car was a suffocating blanket. "That boy could have permanent brain damage," Imani said, the words breaking the silence. She needed to say it. She needed this man, this hollow man in a uniform, to acknowledge the consequence of his actions. "Because of you. Because you couldn't stand being told that a dying man was more important than your ego." Kincaid's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "You should have followed a lawful order," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "This is on you. You resisted." Imani leaned her head back against the hard plastic seat and closed her eyes. It was useless. Arguing with him was like arguing with a brick wall. He was insulated by his badge, by his own certainty, by a system that had clearly taught him that his authority was absolute. He had already convicted her in his mind to justify his own catastrophic misjudgment. The drive to the booking station was a journey from one battlefield to another. She had lost the skirmish on Whisper Creek Lane. She would not lose the war. The John E. Polk Correctional Facility was a place Imani had only ever seen from the outside, a monolithic concrete structure that hummed with a low-grade misery. She had dropped off patients here before, inebriated individuals, people suffering mental health crises who needed medical clearance before being booked. She had always been on the other side of the divide, a respected professional in a clean uniform, her presence a sign of help, not harm. Now, she was being led through the sally port in handcuffs, the heavy steel doors clanging shut behind her, the sound echoing the finality of her situation. Officer Kincaid gripped her arm, steering her through the sterile, beige corridors as if she were a common criminal. The air inside was cold, recycled, and smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. Officers at their desks looked up as they passed, their conversations faltering. Their eyes registered her paramedic uniform first, then the handcuffs, and a wave of confusion and curiosity rippled through the room. A medic in cuffs was not a sight you saw every day. Kincaid pushed her toward the booking desk, a high counter presided over by a world-weary-looking sergeant, a woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair pulled into a tight bun, and a nameplate that read, Rostova. "Got one for booking," Kincaid announced, his voice unnecessarily loud, projecting an air of accomplishment. "Obstruction of justice and assault on a law enforcement officer." Sergeant Rostova looked up from her paperwork, her gaze falling on Imani, then on Kincaid. She raised a skeptical eyebrow, the gesture honed by 30 years of dealing with rookies and their bad arrests. "Assault on you, Kincaid?" She looked back at Imani. "I know you. You're Williams, from Station 9. You brought in that guy who'd been in the MVA on the 408 last week. What in God's name is going on?" Kincaid puffed out his chest slightly, his story ready. "She refused to follow a lawful order at a scene, became combative and interfered with my investigation." "What investigation?" Rostova pressed, her tone sharp and impatient. She wasn't buying it for a second. "I heard the chatter on the radio. You were responding to a medical call on Whisper Creek. A seizure. What exactly did she obstruct? His recovery?" The sarcasm was thick, and a few officers within earshot chuckled. Kincaid's face flushed a deep red. She refused to provide identification and was physically non-compliant. "Officer, I was actively treating a critical patient," Imani interjected, her voice calm and measured, refusing to be drawn into a shouting match. "I informed your officer that I would provide any necessary credentials as soon as the patient was stabilized for transport. The man's life was the immediate priority." Rostova's eyes narrowed, looking from Imani's resolute, exhausted face to Kincaid's defensive, flushed one. The veteran sergeant could smell a bad arrest from a mile away, and this one reeked. "You pulled a medic away from a critical patient to ask for her driver's license?" she asked Kincaid, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "Is that what you're telling me right now?" "I was securing the scene," Kincaid insisted, but his voice had lost some of its bluster under her withering gaze. Rostova just shook her head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on her face. She had seen too many young officers like him, drunk on a thimbleful of power. She turned to the booking officer, a younger man who looked deeply uncomfortable. "Process her, and be quick about it. Get her union rep on the phone." She shot a final dismissive glare at Kincaid. "My office, now." The booking process was a systematic stripping away of dignity. Imani's fingerprints were taken, the black ink smearing on her skin, a stark contrast to the life-saving work those hands had been doing less than an hour ago. A mugshot was taken, the harsh flash of the camera capturing her exhausted but defiant expression. She was instructed to remove her personal belongings, her wallet, which contained her driver's license and her paramedic certifications, her phone, her watch, the simple silver band on her left ring finger. Each item, a small piece of her identity, was placed in a clear plastic bag and catalogued with bureaucratic indifference. The irony was suffocating. The very identification Kincaid had deemed more important than a man's life was now being handled as evidence of her supposed crime. The young officer handling the booking, a man named Patterson, seemed mortified by the entire situation. He handled her credentials with a reverence that bordered on an apology. 17 years of service, advanced cardiac life support, pediatric advanced life support, he muttered, reading from her certifications as he logged them. He looked up at her, his eyes full of a conflict he couldn't hide. "Ma'am, did you sustain any injuries during the arrest? The cuffs, are they too tight?" "I'm fine," Imani replied, her voice flat. "But you should ask my patient that question, the one your colleague prevented me from treating." Patterson flinched and quickly looked down, focusing on his paperwork. The message had been received. Through a nearby office door, Imani could hear the muffled but heated sounds of Sergeant Rostova's voice, rising and falling in a controlled fury as she dressed down Officer Kincaid. The words weren't clear, but the tone was. Kincaid wasn't being praised for his decisive action, he was being grilled. The first cracks in his wall of authority were beginning to show. After the paperwork was complete, Officer Patterson led her down a short hallway to a holding cell. The heavy metal door slid open with a groan. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said quietly. "It'll just be until we can get things sorted out." The door slammed shut, and the lock engaged with a deafening clang. Imani was alone. The cell was small, cold, and brutally simple. A concrete bench welded to the wall and a stainless steel toilet. The air tasted of stale regret. Imani sat down, the chill of the bench seeping through her uniform. For the first time since the call came in, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a profound sense of violation. She had dedicated her life to helping people, to being the calm in the storm, to running toward the chaos when everyone else was running away. And for doing her job, for doing what was right, she had been locked in a cage. She put her head in her hands, not in despair, but in a quiet, simmering rage. This was more than just a bad cop having a bad day. This was a systemic failure, a cancerous rot of prejudice and ego that had been allowed to fester, and she was going to burn it to the ground. Time in the holding cell was a thick, syrupy thing that refused to move. Imani measured its passage by the changing shifts of light through the small, high window and the distant, muffled sounds of the station. She heard phones ringing, officers laughing, the routine hum of a world that had not stopped for her injustice. Each minute that passed felt like an accusation, a fresh layer of insult on the injury. She replayed the encounter with Kincaid in her mind, dissecting every word, every action. Could she have handled it differently? Should she have been more compliant, shown him the ID, and hoped for the best? The answer, every single time, was a resolute no. Compliance would have been a betrayal of her patient. It would have meant conceding that a police officer's demand for paperwork superseded a paramedic's duty to save a life. It was a principle she would not, could not, surrender. But the cost of that principle was this: a cold, concrete bench and the gnawing uncertainty about Ethan Collins's fate. She'd been in the cell for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 90 minutes, when she heard footsteps approaching. Not the heavy, purposeful tread of a uniformed officer, but a quicker, more energetic cadence. A man in a tailored gray suit stopped in front of her cell door. He was in his late 40s, with a sharp, intelligent face, a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that seemed to assess everything in a single, sweeping glance. He carried a leather briefcase that looked both expensive and well-used. "Imani Williams?" he asked, his voice calm and confident. Imani stood up and walked to the bars. "Yes. My name is David Sterling. I'm an attorney with the Paramedics Union. Your partner, Marcus, called your battalion chief, and your chief called me. I got here as fast as I could." He offered a small, reassuring smile. "Let's get you out of here." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over Imani. She wasn't alone anymore. The system she had dedicated her life to, the brotherhood and sisterhood of first responders, was now fighting for her. "Thank you for coming." "Don't thank me yet," Sterling said, already pulling a legal pad and a pen from his briefcase. "I've already had a brief and very blunt conversation with Sergeant Rostova. She is displeased with her officer's conduct, to put it mildly. But the arrest report has been filed. Kincaid is doubling down, claiming you assaulted him. We need to build our case, starting right now. I want you to tell me everything that happened from the moment you got the call. Don't leave out a single detail, no matter how small." Imani began her story. With the precision of a trained medical professional reporting a patient's history, she recounted the entire event: the dispatch call, the patient's condition, her initial assessment, the second seizure. Then she described Officer Kincaid's arrival, his tone, his posture, his immediate baseless aggression. She detailed her repeated attempts to explain the medical urgency, his refusal to listen, his physical escalation, and the arrest. Sterling listened intently, his pen flying across the page, his expression growing grimmer with every word. He would occasionally interrupt with a sharp, clarifying question. Did he ever state what crime he was investigating? No, just that he needed to secure the scene. Did he ask about the patient's condition? Did he show any concern for the young man's well-being? None. His only concern was establishing his authority and that I follow his orders. And you told him you would comply once the patient was stabilized? I told him my credentials were in the ambulance and he could verify them with my partner or dispatch, but that I would not stop active treatment of a critical patient. My exact words were, "My patient is my only concern." Sterling nodded, a grim satisfaction on his face. That's perfect. You established a clear willingness to comply once the exigent medical circumstance was resolved. His refusal to accept that is key. He looked up from his notes. Imani, what he did wasn't just a bad judgment call. It was illegal. State law is crystal clear on the issue of interfering with emergency medical personnel. The arrest was unlawful from the moment he laid hands on you. He closed his notepad. They have to release you. The charges of obstruction and assault are baseless. They won't even make it to a prosecutor's desk. This is a classic case of what we call contempt of cop, and it's not a real crime. Kincaid arrested you because you challenged his authority, not because you broke the law. What about my patient? Imani asked, the question that had been tormenting her for hours. Do you know anything? Sterling's expression softened. Marcus gave me an update. He was transported to Orlando Regional. He's in the ICU. The second seizure was prolonged and he suffered significant oxygen deprivation. The doctors are worried about anoxic brain injury. He's in a medically induced coma. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. The delay in definitive care. It's going to be a major factor in this case. If the worst happens, this goes from being an unlawful arrest to a potential wrongful death suit. The city knows that. They're already in damage control mode. True to David Sterling's word, the cell door slid open 40 minutes later. Sergeant Rostova was standing there, her expression stern. You're being released on your own recognizance, Williams. The charges are being reviewed, but I don't expect them to stick. She handed Imani the large plastic bag containing her belongings. For what it's worth, she said, her voice low enough that only Imani could hear, I'm sorry this happened. He was out of line. Imani just nodded, taking her property. The apology was a small concession from a broken system, but it was something. As she walked out of the station with Sterling at her side, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun, she felt like she was surfacing after being held underwater. She was free, but she wasn't whole. A part of her was still back in that living room, fighting for a life that had been needlessly endangered. And another part of her was now steeling itself for the bigger fight to come. This wasn't over. It had just begun. Marcus was waiting for her in the parking lot, leaning against the side of their ambulance. His uniform was rumpled, and his face was etched with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He straightened up as soon as he saw her, rushing forward to pull her into a firm, brotherly hug. Imani, my God, are you okay? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. I've been better, she said, pulling back. Tell me about Ethan. What's the latest? Marcus's face clouded over. He took a deep breath. It's bad, really bad. I stayed at the hospital until the chief made me leave. The neurologist came out to talk to his parents. Because of the prolonged hypoxia during the second seizure, they're saying there's significant, irreversible brain damage. They don't know how much yet. They won't know until they try to wake him up. But they're preparing the family for the worst. The delay, Imani. The doctor said those few minutes of delay in getting him advanced airway management and transport. He said it likely turned a manageable event into a catastrophic one. The words landed like stones in her stomach. Every paramedic lives with the fear of losing a patient. But this was different. This wasn't a loss to a disease or an injury that was beyond her control. This was a loss to a man's ego. Those precious minutes Kincaid had stolen from them while he postured and demanded and finally arrested her were the minutes Ethan Collins's brain was suffocating. The image of Kincaid's smug face flashed in her mind, and her simmering anger ignited into a white-hot flame. His family? Imani asked, her voice tight. Devastated. His mother, Sarah, she's a wreck. But she knows what happened. She told the hospital staff, the police supervisor, everyone. She's our best witness. David Sterling, who had been standing back to give them a moment, stepped forward. His expression was grim. "This confirms our path forward," he said. "The harm is no longer theoretical. We have a direct, documented, and catastrophic consequence of Officer Kincaid's actions. We're no longer just talking about your civil rights being violated, Imani. We're talking about a young man who may be permanently disabled or die because a police officer couldn't handle being told that his request wasn't the most important thing in the universe." They drove to Sterling's office, a sleek, modern space in downtown Orlando that felt a world away from the grit of the holding cell. For the next 3 hours, Imani gave a formal, recorded statement. Sterling's team was already at work, filing motions, contacting witnesses, and drafting the initial complaint. A paralegal brought in the contact information for the owners of the house next door to the Collinses. The neighbor had called the law firm, reporting that their front door security camera, which had a wide-angle view of the street and the Collinses' front yard, had likely captured the entire incident outside the house. "The city's first move will be to try and discredit you," Sterling explained as they worked. "They'll dig into your record, your personal life, anything they can find to paint you as an unstable, insubordinate hothead. But they're going to come up empty. Your service record is impeccable. You have commendations for valor. You have 0 disciplinary actions against you in 17 years as a paramedic. You are, for lack of a better term, the perfect plaintiff." He pointed to a paragraph in the draft of the lawsuit. "We are filing a federal lawsuit under Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act. We will argue that Officer Kincaid, acting under the color of law, deprived you of your Fourth Amendment rights against unlawful seizure and your 14th Amendment right to due process. Furthermore, we are adding state-level claims for intentional interference with emergency medical care, false arrest, and battery." He looked her directly in the eye. "We will be suing Officer Kincaid individually and the city of Orlando for failure to train and supervise its officers. We are not just going after the soldier, we are going after the army that sent him into battle unprepared." The lawsuit was filed electronically at 9 a.m. the next morning. It was an explosive document, detailing in cold, legal language the horrifying events of the previous day. It named Officer Daniel Kincaid and the city of Orlando as defendants, and sought unspecified damages for the violation of Imani's civil rights, emotional distress, and damage to her professional reputation. Within an hour, the media storm began. A local news station, tipped off by Sterling's office, ran the first story. The headline was electrifying. "Hero paramedic arrested while saving seizure patient. Family blames police for son's grave condition." The story went viral. The image of Imani, a black female paramedic, being arrested by a white police officer struck a raw nerve in a country already grappling with issues of race and policing. Her phone began to light up with calls and texts from friends, family, and colleagues from across the state, all expressing their shock and support. The fire department issued a statement standing firmly behind Imani, calling her a model paramedic and her actions heroic. The police department, in contrast, issued a terse, defensive statement, saying the incident was under internal investigation and that Officer Kincaid had been placed on administrative desk duty. The battle lines had been drawn. In the world of high-stakes litigation, the first move from a defendant like a city is often a test of resolve, a calculated probe to see if the opposition will flinch. 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, David Sterling received a call from the city attorney's office. It was the call he had been expecting. "They want to talk settlement," he told Imani over the phone. "They're trying to gauge how serious we are, hoping to make this go away before it gets any uglier." "What are they offering?" Imani asked, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She was on paid leave from the job she loved, her days a surreal blend of fielding supportive phone calls and trying to keep a semblance of normalcy for her children, who were confused and frightened by the news reports. Sterling let out a short, humorless laugh. "You should sit down for this. They're offering to pay your legal fees and give you $25,000 for your trouble. They called it a nuisance value settlement. Imani was silent for a moment, processing the sheer, unmitigated gall of the offer. $25,000. It wasn't a settlement. It was an insult. It was the monetary equivalent of a pat on the head and a suggestion that she should have known her place. It was a pittance meant to make the problem, the gross violation of her rights, the near-fatal dereliction of an officer's duty, the life-altering injury to Ethan Collins, disappear before it got too expensive or embarrassing. It was an offer made by people who saw this not as a moral travesty, but as a public relations inconvenience to be managed. "Tell them no," Imani said, her voice laced with ice. The brief flicker of hope that this could be resolved quickly and cleanly was extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "Tell them I'll see them in court." "That's what I thought you'd say," Sterling replied, a note of pride in his voice. "I already told them their offer was offensive and that our next conversation would be during depositions. This was their gambit. They were hoping you were just looking for a quick payday, that the pressure and the media attention would make you fold." He paused. "They misjudged you. Badly." They had. The city's lawyers and risk managers had made a critical error. They had mistaken Imani's quiet professionalism for weakness. They didn't understand that her fight was no longer just about her own vindication. It had become inextricably linked to the fate of Ethan Collins. Ethan had survived, but just barely. He had spent 6 days in a medically induced coma. When the doctors had tried to wake him, the news was devastating. The prolonged lack of oxygen had caused a severe anoxic brain injury. He could breathe on his own, but he was in what they called a persistent vegetative state. He could open his eyes, but he showed no signs of awareness, no recognition of his heartbroken parents who kept a constant vigil at his bedside. He would likely need round-the-clock care for the rest of his life. At 20 years old, his future, the soccer scholarship, graduation, a career, a family of his own, had been erased in the span of a few minutes by one police officer's catastrophic arrogance. His family had retained their own lawyer and were preparing a separate multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the city. The two cases, while legally distinct, were now morally inseparable. Every victory for Imani would be a victory for Ethan. The city's refusal to take her lawsuit seriously had the opposite effect they intended. Instead of silencing her, it galvanized her, and it enraged the public. When news of the nuisance value offer leaked to the press, a strategic leak from Sterling's office, the story exploded with renewed fury. Editorials were written condemning the city's callousness. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a textbook example of police overreach and municipal arrogance. A GoFundMe page started by Imani's fire station to help the Collins family with their astronomical medical bills was flooded with donations from strangers across the country. Paramedics from as far away as California and New York sent messages of solidarity. She had become an unwilling symbol for every first responder who had ever been bullied, questioned, or impeded by a law enforcement officer on a power trip. The pressure on the city mounted. The police chief held a press conference where he was hammered with questions about Officer Kincaid's disciplinary record. It was revealed that Kincaid, in his short 3-year career, had already accumulated over a dozen citizen complaints for excessive force and abuse of authority, none of which had resulted in any significant disciplinary action. He was a lawsuit waiting to happen, a problem the department had ignored until it blew up in their faces on a national stage. For Imani, life had become a whirlwind. She tried to keep a low profile, but her face was everywhere. She'd be recognized at the grocery store, with strangers stopping her to shake her hand and thank her for standing up. The attention was uncomfortable, but it strengthened her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for Ethan. She was fighting for all of them. Sterling used the intense media scrutiny to his advantage. "We're moving into the discovery phase," he told her during one of their strategy sessions. "This is where they have to turn over everything. Kincaid's complete personnel file, all internal emails and memos related to the incident, and most importantly, The one piece of evidence that will decide this case. The unedited footage from the neighbor's security camera. He leaned forward, his expression intense. Kincaid thinks his report will protect him. The city thinks their lawyers can spin this. But the camera doesn't spin. It just shows. And what it's going to show a jury is a hero trying to save a life, and a bully with a badge who was willing to let a man die to prove a point. They wanted to silence this story with a check. Instead, they've guaranteed that it will be told under oath in a federal courtroom. The discovery process in a federal lawsuit is a slow, methodical grinding of legal gears. A battle fought not in a courtroom, but through a relentless exchange of documents and data. For months, David Sterling's office was inundated with thousands of pages from the city. Training manuals, internal affairs reports, policy guidelines, and Officer Kincaid's complete unredacted personnel file. It painted a damning picture of a young officer with a clear pattern of aggression and a troubling number of complaints that had been consistently dismissed with little more than a slap on the wrist. But all of it was secondary to the single digital file they had been waiting for. It arrived on a password-protected hard drive delivered by a court courier. It was the footage from the neighbor's security camera. Sterling had it set up in a conference room on a large monitor. Imani sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Marcus was there too, for support and to corroborate the sequence of events. Sarah Collins had declined to come. Reliving it was still too painful. "Are you ready for this?" Sterling asked her gently. Imani took a deep breath and nodded. "Play it." The video was silent, captured from a high angle across the street. The quality was remarkably clear. It began with the serene image of a quiet Sunday morning. Then, Imani's ambulance pulls up, lights flashing. She and Marcus rush into the house. A few minutes pass. Then, Officer Kincaid's patrol car arrives. He gets out, his posture immediately rigid and confrontational. He disappears inside the house. For several minutes, nothing is visible, but the tension is palpable even without audio. The viewer knows what is happening inside those walls. Then, the front door bursts open. The camera perfectly captures Kincaid dragging a handcuffed Imani out of the house. Her face is a mask of shock and fury. He is visibly aggressive, shoving her toward the patrol car. The camera captures him pushing her into the back seat and slamming the door. It captures Marcus running out, gesturing frantically. It captures the arrival of the second ambulance, the desperate work to get Ethan onto the stretcher, and the long, agonizing minutes he lies on the porch before being loaded for transport. It captures every second of the delay Kincaid caused. It was visceral, immediate, and utterly irrefutable. It perfectly corroborated Imani's story and obliterated Kincaid's. His report claimed she was combative and that he had to subdue her. The video showed a calm, professional woman being violently assaulted and arrested for no reason. His report neglected to mention the second ambulance or the significant delay in patient transport. The video made that delay the centerpiece of the tragedy. It was a silent movie that screamed the truth. When the video ended, the conference room was silent. Marcus was shaking his head, his face pale. Imani felt strangely numb, vindicated, but also sickened. It was all there. Every lie in Kincaid's report, every self-serving statement the city had made was obliterated by this single, unblinking recording of the truth. David Sterling sat back in his chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. He looked at Imani. "In 25 years of practicing law," he said, his voice quiet with awe, "I have never seen a more powerful piece of evidence. That camera didn't just record an unlawful arrest, it recorded a man's soul. It recorded his arrogance, his insecurity, and his utter disregard for human life. We don't even need the audio. The picture tells the entire story." He stood up and began to pace the room, energized, a predator who had just caught the scent of his prey. "This changes everything. Their strategy was to paint you as the aggressor, as uncooperative. This video proves you were the victim of an unprovoked assault. It proves Kincaid was the sole source of chaos at that scene. He wasn't a cop maintaining order. He was a bully who couldn't handle a woman telling him she had more important things to do than stroke his ego. Sterling stopped pacing and looked at the blank screen. The city's lawyers will see this footage, and they will know their case is unwinnable. They'll come back to the table with a real settlement offer. A big one. He turned to Imani, his eyes glinting. But that's not what we're going to do. We're not going to let them bury this video in a confidential settlement. We're going to show this video to a jury. We're going to put it up on a screen 10 feet high and let 12 ordinary citizens see what Officer Daniel Kincaid did on that quiet Sunday morning. We're going to depose him, make him watch it, and make him explain every single second of it under oath. This case is no longer about getting you a settlement, Imani. It's about getting you justice. The kind of justice that changes laws and ends careers. The kind of justice that ensures this never, ever happens to another first responder again. The video wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a weapon. And Sterling was ready to go to war. A deposition is not a trial. There is no judge, no jury. It takes place in the sterile, airless confines of a law firm's conference room. But in many ways, it is more grueling. It is a slow, methodical dissection of a witness's story designed to lock them into a version of events they cannot later change and to expose every weakness, every contradiction, every lie. Officer Daniel Kincaid walked into the deposition room flanked by 2 attorneys from the city. He wore a crisp suit, not his uniform, but he carried himself with the same air of unshakable confidence he'd had on Whisper Creek Lane. He was there to defend his actions, to project the image of a decisive officer who had been forced to take control of a chaotic scene from an uncooperative paramedic. He believed his badge, his report, and his version of the story would protect him. He was wrong. For the first hour, the city's lead attorney led Kincaid through his own testimony, allowing him to construct his narrative. He described arriving at what he perceived to be a disorderly scene, his attempts to secure the area, and Paramedic Williams's immediate and hostile refusal to comply with his lawful orders. He painted a picture of himself as the calm center of a storm, a professional doing his job. He claimed Imani had tensed up and pulled away in an aggressive manner, forcing him to place her in handcuffs for his own safety. Then, it was David Sterling's turn. Sterling began calmly, his questions simple and direct. Officer Kincaid, you've been with the Orlando Police Department for 3 years, is that correct? Yes, sir. And in that time, have you received training on interacting with other first responders at emergency scenes? Yes, sir. We receive extensive training. And does that training instruct you that the immediate life-saving care of a patient is the top priority at a medical emergency? Kincaid shifted in his seat. My priority is to secure the scene for the safety of all personnel. That wasn't my question, officer, Sterling said, his voice still mild. Does your training instruct you that a paramedic's active treatment of a critical patient takes precedence over administrative requests, like asking for identification? The city's attorney objected, but Sterling just smiled. Let me rephrase. At any point did you believe the patient, Mr. Collins, was not in serious medical distress? I am not a medical professional, Kincaid said stiffly. I could not make that assessment. Exactly, Sterling pounced, his voice sharpening. You are not a medical professional, yet you felt qualified to order the actual medical professional on scene to stop providing care. Is that correct? I ordered her to step back so I could secure the scene. Sterling nodded slowly, then turned to his paralegal. Please play the first video exhibit, security footage, timestamp 10/14/22. The large monitor at the end of the conference table flickered to life. The deposition room was suddenly filled with the silent, damning footage. Sterling had Kincaid watch the first 2 minutes, showing his arrival and his immediate disappearance into the house. Then he fast-forwarded. Let's move to timestamp 10/19/58. The image jumped to the front door bursting open, with Kincaid dragging the handcuffed Imani across the lawn. He paused the video on a crystal-clear frame of Kincaid's hand gripping Imani's arm, her face contorted in pain and shock. "Officer," Sterling said, his voice cold as ice, "you testified moments ago that Paramedic Williams became combative and that you had to subdue her. Does this video depict a combative suspect, or does it depict a woman in a paramedic's uniform being assaulted by a police officer?" Kincaid stared at the screen, his confidence beginning to crack. "The video doesn't show what happened inside. She was resisting." "Resisting what, officer? Resisting being pulled away from her dying patient?" Sterling let the question hang in the air before playing the next segment, which showed the agonizing 2-minute delay before Marcus and the new paramedic team could get Ethan out of the house. He paused it again. "Officer, on this video we can see the patient lying unattended on the porch for nearly 2 minutes while his brain is being deprived of oxygen. Is that what you would define as securing the scene for the safety of all personnel?" For the next 4 hours, Sterling dismantled Kincaid's story piece by piece, using the silent, irrefutable video as the wrecking ball. He forced Kincaid to watch himself shove Sarah Collins. "Is threatening the grieving mother of a critical patient part of your training, officer?" He forced him to watch the long, empty minutes after he drove away with Imani, leaving one paramedic to manage a crisis. "Were you aware that the patient suffered a second catastrophic seizure immediately after you arrested the lead paramedic on scene?" By the end of the deposition, Daniel Kincaid was a changed man. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, defensive silence. His carefully constructed narrative of a hero cop had been exposed as a self-serving fantasy. The video transcript would show him to be evasive, argumentative, and ultimately unable to provide a single credible justification for his actions. He had walked into the room a confident officer of the law. He walked out a man who knew his career was over. The city's attorneys knew it too. Their faces were grim. They had built their entire defense around the testimony of their officer, and Sterling had just reduced that testimony to rubble. The unblinking eye of the camera, combined with Sterling's relentless questioning, had left them with nothing. Their star witness had just become their biggest liability. The truth had been locked in under oath, and the price for the city was about to go up, dramatically. The day after the deposition, David Sterling's phone rang. It was the lead counsel for the city of Orlando. The tone was no longer dismissive or condescending. It was the sound of utter and complete defeat. "They want to settle," Sterling told Imani later that day in his office. He couldn't hide the triumphant grin on his face. "They know the deposition was an unmitigated disaster. They know what that security footage will do to a jury. They know Kincaid is the least credible witness in the history of American jurisprudence. They are no longer talking about nuisance value." He slid a piece of paper across the polished surface of his desk. On it was a single number, written in blue ink. $20 million. Imani stared at the figure. $20 million. It was an incredible, incomprehensible amount of money, a life-changing sum that felt more like a lottery jackpot than a legal settlement. It was a clear and unequivocal admission of guilt, a desperate signal that the city knew it had no legal leg to stand on and was willing to pay almost any price to prevent this case from going to a jury. A year's salary for her was around $65,000. This was more than 300 times that. It was enough to pay off her mortgage, set up college funds for her children and grandchildren, and live without financial worry for the rest of her life. It was everything the city had said her ordeal wasn't worth, and then some. Part of her, the tired part that had been living this nightmare for months, wanted to scream, yes. She wanted it to be over. She wanted to stop the endless meetings with lawyers, the glare of the media attention, the gnawing anxiety of the impending trial. She wanted to go back to her life, to her ambulance, to the simple, profound work of saving people. She wanted her name back, free from the association with lawsuits and conflict. "What do you think?" she asked Sterling, her voice quiet. Sterling leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "From a purely financial perspective, it's a phenomenal offer. It's one of the largest civil rights settlements in the state's history. If you take this, you walk away with generational wealth, and we can force them to expunge the arrest record and issue a formal public apology as part of the deal. No one would blame you for a second for taking it." He paused, his gaze steady and serious. "But you didn't come to me for a purely financial perspective. You came to me for justice." Justice. The word hung in the air between them. Was this justice? A check and a quiet end to the affair? Officer Kincaid would undoubtedly be fired, but the system that created him, the policies that enabled him, the blue wall of silence that protected officers like him would remain unchanged. The next Officer Kincaid in another city, on another quiet street, could do the very same thing to another paramedic. The money would fix her problems, but it wouldn't fix the problem. She thought about Ethan Collins, lying silent and still in a long-term care facility, his life stolen from him. She thought about his parents, their joy replaced by a lifetime of sorrow and caregiving. She thought about the messages of support she'd received from EMTs and paramedics across the country, stories of their own run-ins with police, of being bullied, threatened, and treated like subordinates instead of partners. She thought of the fear they all felt, the worry that doing their job correctly could cost them their own freedom. This wasn't just her fight anymore. The media attention, the leak of the nuisance offer, Kincaid's disastrous deposition, it had all turned her case into something bigger. It had become a test case, a potential landmark for the rights of all first responders. "This offer comes with a non-disclosure agreement, doesn't it?" Imani asked, already knowing the answer. Sterling nodded. "Of course. An ironclad one. They want your silence. They'll pay a premium for it. Their #1 priority is making sure that security camera footage is never shown in a public court. They want to make sure Kincaid's deposition transcript is never released. They want to bury this story so deep it can never be used as a precedent." That was the deal breaker. They wanted to buy her story. They wanted to buy her silence, to bury the truth she had fought so hard to bring to light. They wanted to pay her to pretend this never happened. "No," Imani said, the single word firm and clear. The doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "No deal." A slow smile spread across David Sterling's face. It was the answer he had been hoping for. "I thought you might say that." "This isn't about the money, David," Imani continued, leaning forward, her eyes flashing with a fire he hadn't seen before. "It was never about the money. This is about making sure that no paramedic, no EMT, no firefighter ever has to hesitate to treat a patient because they're afraid of the police officer standing over their shoulder. I want that security footage shown in court. I want Kincaid to have to answer for what he did in front of a jury of our peers. And I want a verdict that sends a message not just to the city of Orlando, but to every police department in this country. You do not interfere with medical personnel who are saving a life. Period." Her stand was a declaration. She was turning down a fortune for a principle. She was choosing the uncertainty and agony of a public trial over the comfort and security of a private settlement. It was a choice that required immense courage. But for Imani, it was the only choice she could live with. She had fought for her patient in that living room, and now she would fight for every patient and every paramedic in a court of law. The city thought they could buy her off. They were about to learn that her integrity was not for sale. With settlement talks officially dead, the machinery of the federal court system ground toward a trial date. The weeks leading up to it were a blur of intense preparation for Imani. David Sterling and his team put her through mock cross-examinations, peppering her with the most aggressive, accusatory questions the city's lawyers could possibly devise. They wanted to prepare her for the stress of the witness stand, to ensure that her composure, which had been so powerful on the day of the incident, would hold under the pressure of a courtroom. The trial was not just a legal proceeding, it was a form of theater, and the first act was jury selection, or voir dire. This was where the tone of the entire trial would be set. It was a painstaking process of questioning a pool of ordinary citizens to uncover biases, both conscious and unconscious, that could influence their judgment. Imani sat at the plaintiff's table beside David Sterling, watching as dozens of potential jurors were brought into the stately, wood-paneled courtroom. They were a cross-section of the community: teachers, retirees, mechanics, small business owners. 12 of them would be chosen to decide her fate. The city's legal team, led by a sharp, immaculately dressed man named Jonathan Pierce, was looking for a specific type of juror. They wanted people who were instinctively pro-law enforcement, people who believed that questioning a police officer was inherently wrong. Their questions were transparent. Do you believe it is a citizen's duty to comply with any order given by a police officer without question? And, do you have any family members who have had a negative experience with law enforcement? They were searching for authoritarians, for people who would see Kincaid's uniform and automatically grant him the benefit of the doubt. David Sterling's approach was the opposite. He was searching for empathy and critical thinking. He was looking for people who could understand the concept of conflicting duties, people who trusted medical professionals, and people who were skeptical of unchecked authority. His questions were more nuanced. Imagine a situation where a firefighter tells you to evacuate a building because it's on fire, but a police officer tells you to stay put for an investigation. In that moment of conflict, whose expertise would you be more inclined to trust regarding the immediate threat to your life? One potential juror, a stern-looking man in his 60s, answered without hesitation. "You follow the cop's orders. He's in charge of the scene." Pierce made a large, approving check mark on his legal pad. Sterling politely thanked the man and, when his turn came, used one of his peremptory challenges to strike him from the jury. Another potential juror, a young woman who worked as a software developer, was questioned by Pierce. "Do you believe police officers have a difficult and dangerous job?" "Of course," the young woman answered. "And do you believe they sometimes have to make split-second decisions to maintain control?" "Yes," she said thoughtfully. "But I also believe they have a responsibility not to create a crisis where one doesn't exist." Pierce thanked her and moved on, but Sterling's eyes lingered on the woman. He had found someone who could see the gray areas, someone who wouldn't be blinded by a badge. The process took 2 full days. It was a fascinating high-stakes exercise in human psychology. Imani watched as potential jurors were dismissed for a variety of reasons. A man whose brother was a police officer was struck by Sterling. A woman who expressed deep distrust for all forms of government authority was struck by the city. Slowly, methodically, the pool was whittled down. By the end of the second day, they had their jury: 12 citizens and 2 alternates. It was a diverse group. The young software developer had made it. So had a registered nurse, a high school science teacher, a retired Air Force logistician, a stay-at-home mother, and a plumber. Sterling was pleased. It was not a jury that was inherently anti-police, but it was a jury of thoughtful, independent thinkers. They were people who respected authority but were not blinded by it. They were people who would be able to watch that silent security footage and see not an officer and a civilian, but 2 public servants with competing duties, and judge which duty was more important. They were people who would understand the sacred life-or-death responsibility that rested on Imani's shoulders that morning. As they left the courthouse that evening, the reality of the situation finally hit Imani with its full weight. The next morning, the trial would begin. Her life, her reputation, and a cause that had become bigger than herself would be placed in the hands of those 12 strangers. "How are you feeling?" Sterling asked, sensing her anxiety as they walked down the marble steps of the courthouse. "Like I'm about to run the most important call of my life," Imani admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Sterling stopped and placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression serious. "You've been preparing for this your whole life, Imani. Not in law books, but in the back of an ambulance, in every crisis you've ever managed. All you have to do tomorrow is the same thing you did on Whisper Creek Lane. Stay calm, be professional, and tell the truth. The truth is all we need." His words were a comfort, but as she drove home through the deepening twilight, Imani knew that the truth was a fragile thing. In a courtroom, it could be twisted, obscured, and attacked. Her principled stand had led her to this moment. Now, all she could do was trust that the truth, and the 12 people chosen to hear it, would be enough. The trial began not with Imani, but with Sarah Collins. David Sterling knew that before the jury could understand the crime against Imani, they had to understand the stakes. They had to see the human cost of Officer Kincaid's actions. Sarah walked slowly to the witness stand, a woman aged a decade in a few short months. The vibrant energy Imani had seen on that terrible morning was gone, replaced by a fragile, hollowed-out grief. Sterling approached the witness stand, his demeanor gentle and respectful. "Mrs. Collins, could you please tell the jury about your son, Ethan?" Sarah took a shaky breath, clutching a small, crumpled tissue in her hand. "Ethan, he was my sunshine," she began, her voice thick with unshed tears. "He was a sophomore at UCF, on a soccer scholarship. So full of life. He loved making people laugh." She described his life, his dreams, painting a vivid picture of the vibrant young man who had been stolen from them. Then, Sterling guided her through the morning of the incident. She recounted the terror of finding her son seizing, the relief of seeing Imani's ambulance arrive, and the calm competence with which Imani took control. "She was an angel," Sarah said, looking directly at Imani. "She was so calm, so professional. She was saving my son's life. I knew he was going to be okay because she was there." Her testimony turned dark as she described Kincaid's arrival. Her voice trembled with anger as she recounted his immediate aggression, his refusal to listen, and the moment he physically tore Imani away from Ethan. He grabbed her," she sobbed, the memory raw and painful. "He pulled her off my son while he was helpless on the floor, and then Ethan started shaking again. It was worse this time, so much worse. The woman who was saving him was in handcuffs on my lawn, and my baby was dying in my living room." The courtroom was silent, save for the sound of Sarah's weeping. Pierce's cross-examination was cautious. He knew he had to tread lightly. Attacking a grieving mother was a risky strategy. "Mrs. Collins," he began, "you have a separate lawsuit filed against the city, don't you?" "Yes," she said, her grief momentarily hardening into resolve. "To pay for the machines that keep my son alive. To pay for the nurses who have to do everything for him. Because he will never walk or talk or laugh again." Pierce had no more questions. He had tried to paint her as a biased witness motivated by money, and instead she had delivered the most powerful indictment of his client's actions imaginable. The next day it was Imani's turn. She walked to the stand with a quiet confidence, her testimony clear, concise, and devoid of melodrama. She spoke not as a victim but as a professional, explaining a catastrophic failure in interagency cooperation. Then, Sterling walked to the large screen set up in front of the jury box. "Your Honor, the plaintiff would now like to play the security camera footage." The lights in the courtroom were dimmed. For the next 5 minutes, the jury was transported to Whisper Creek Lane. They saw Kincaid drag Imani from the house. They saw her being forced into the patrol car. They saw the agonizing delay as a single paramedic struggled to get Ethan to the hospital. A juror, the registered nurse, put her hand over her mouth in shock. They weren't just hearing about the arrest anymore, they were witnessing an assault. When the lights came up, the impact was visceral. The footage had transformed the case. It was no longer a matter of he said, she said. It was a matter of objective, undeniable reality. The defense had no choice but to call their only witness, Officer Daniel Kincaid. He walked to the stand, his face a grim mask. He knew what was coming. His lawyer led him through his testimony, but his claims of a chaotic scene and a belligerent paramedic sounded absurd after the jury had just seen the silent, damning truth. Then it was Sterling's turn for cross-examination. He approached the witness stand not with anger, but with a quiet, surgical precision. "Officer Kincaid," he began, "we've all seen the footage. We saw you arrest a paramedic while she was actively treating a young man whose life was in her hands. I have only one question for you. Watching that footage today, Knowing now that your actions directly contributed to Ethan Collins suffering a catastrophic brain injury, is there anything you would have done differently? It was a lifeline, a chance for Kincaid to show some remorse, some humanity. He could have said, "In hindsight, I should have waited." He could have said, "I misjudged the situation." He could have said anything to show the jury he understood the gravity of his mistake. But he didn't. His pride, the same pride that had caused this disaster, would not let him. "No," Kincaid said, his voice defiant. "I stand by my actions. I was following my training to secure the scene." Sterling let the answer hang in the air, a stunning admission of unrepentant arrogance. He walked back to the plaintiff's table. "No further questions, Your Honor." It was a mic drop moment. In that single defiant answer, Daniel Kincaid had sealed his own fate and the fate of the city he worked for. He had looked the jury in the eye and told them that, given the chance, he would do it all again. The closing arguments were brief. The city's attorney pleaded with the jury not to judge his client with the benefit of hindsight. Then Sterling rose. He simply pointed at Imani, and then at the empty space on the witness stand where Sarah Collins had sat. He held up a single still photo printed from the security footage, the image of Kincaid shoving Imani toward his car. He said nothing for a full 30 seconds. "The evidence speaks for itself," he said quietly. "And so does the arrogance of the man who caused all this pain. Send a message. Send a message that competence will not be punished by insecurity. Send a message that duty will not be shackled by ego. Send a message that what happened to Imani Williams and Ethan Collins will never be acceptable in this community. Not now, not ever." The jury filed out. The wait began. An hour passed, then another. Just before 4 p.m., the bailiff announced they had reached a verdict. The jurors filed back into the box, their faces unreadable. The foreman handed a slip of paper to the clerk. "In the matter of Williams versus Kincaid and the city of Orlando," the clerk began, her voice echoing in the silent room, "on the claim of unlawful seizure, we, the jury, find for the plaintiff, Imani Williams. On the claim of false arrest, we find for the plaintiff, Imani Williams. On the claim of battery, we find for the plaintiff, Imani Williams." Imani squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming down her face. David Sterling put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "For compensatory damages, including emotional distress and reputational harm, we award the plaintiff $2 million, the clerk continued. And for punitive damages to be levied against Officer Daniel Kincaid and the city of Orlando for its willful and reckless disregard for the plaintiff's constitutional rights, we award the plaintiff $18 million. The courtroom erupted. $20 million. It was a thunderous verdict, a number so large it was clearly meant not just to compensate, but to punish and to reform. The jury hadn't just sided with Imani, they had adopted her outrage. They had sent the message Sterling had asked for, a message so loud and clear it would be heard in every police precinct and city hall in America. Imani sobbed, not for the money, but for the overwhelming sense of vindication. Justice had been done. The verdict was more than a legal victory, it was an earthquake. The $20 million judgment sent shockwaves through the city of Orlando and beyond. It was a headline-grabbing figure that forced an immediate and painful reckoning within the city's leadership and its police department. The message from the jury was unequivocal. The old way of doing business, of protecting bad cops and ignoring systemic problems, was no longer acceptable and would come at a devastating financial cost. The first domino to fall was Officer Daniel Kincaid. Less than a week after the verdict, following a rushed internal affairs investigation that suddenly found the courage to state the obvious, he was fired from the Orlando Police Department. His career in law enforcement was over, his name forever linked to one of the largest civil rights verdicts in the state's history. But the changes didn't stop there. Facing immense public pressure and the looming, even larger lawsuit from Ethan Collins's family, which they promptly settled out of court for an undisclosed but reportedly massive sum, the city council approved a sweeping overhaul of police training and policy. They brought in outside consultants to rewrite the department's protocols for interacting with other first responders. The new policy, which became known informally as Imani's Law, was explicit. At a medical emergency scene, the senior paramedic, or EMT, was in command of patient care, and any interference by law enforcement outside of a direct threat to life was grounds for immediate disciplinary action and potential termination. The story of Imani's ordeal and the staggering verdict became a case study in police academies and paramedic training programs nationwide. The silent security camera footage, once a piece of evidence, was now a powerful educational tool. It was used to teach new recruits on both sides of the divide about the critical importance of communication, respect, and a clear understanding of roles at an emergency scene. It showed in stark, undeniable detail how arrogance and a rigid adherence to authority could escalate a situation with tragic consequences. For Imani, the aftermath was a whirlwind. She was hailed as a hero, a champion for first responders. She was invited to speak at national EMS conferences and was instrumental in lobbying the Florida state legislature. A year after her trial, the governor signed the First Responder Protection Act into law, a bill that codified many of the principles her case had brought to light, creating specific legal protections for medical personnel against obstruction or interference while performing their duties. Imani stood beside the governor at the signing ceremony, a reluctant but powerful symbol of change. She eventually returned to work at Station 9. The money from the verdict afforded her financial freedom, but she couldn't imagine doing anything else. The ambulance, the adrenaline, the profound privilege of being the person someone called on the worst day of their life. It was a part of who she was. Things were different, though. When she arrived at scenes, police officers treated her with a new level of respect, almost a reverence. They kept their distance. They offered help. They deferred to her medical judgment. Her battle had created a safer environment for all of her colleagues. She had fought the war so they could do their jobs in peace. In the quiet moments after a storm, reflection offers a clarity that the chaos itself can never provide. Looking back, it becomes possible to see the intricate web of choices and circumstances that led to that sun-drenched confrontation on Whisper Creek Lane. What drove Officer Daniel Kincaid? It wasn't simple malice. It was something more insidious, a deep-seated insecurity masked by a rigid, aggressive interpretation of authority. Perhaps he had been trained to see the world as a series of threats to be neutralized, where compliance equals safety and questions equal defiance. In his mind, Imani's refusal to immediately obey his command, despite her clear duty to her patient, was perceived not as a difference of professional opinion, but as a direct threat to his identity as an officer. His badge was not a tool for service, it was armor for his fragile ego. If Kincaid had been able to pause, to listen, to see the seizing young man on the ground as a person instead of a prop in his own power play, the entire tragedy could have been averted. If his training had emphasized de-escalation and interagency respect as much as it emphasized officer safety and control, he might have become Imani's greatest ally on that roadside instead of her worst obstacle. And what of Imani? If she had been less confident, less forged by the pressures of her 17 years of service, would she have backed down? If she hadn't possessed that core of steel, perhaps she would have made the easy choice to show her ID, gambling with a stranger's life to avoid a confrontation. The victory was born not just from the injustice of the moment, but from a lifetime of preparation that had unknowingly armed her for that specific fight. Her refusal was not an act of spontaneous defiance, but the logical conclusion of a career spent prioritizing life above all else. The incident reminds us that true courage isn't about being confrontational. It's about holding fast to one's principles when it is most difficult, when the personal cost is highest. It's about understanding that sometimes the most powerful action is a firm, quiet, and unshakable no. This story is a testament to the fact that one person's unwavering commitment to their duty can expose and correct a systemic flaw. creating a legacy of safety and respect for thousands who follow. What do you think is the most important lesson from Imani's story? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please support our channel so we can continue to bring you these important stories.